Welcome to Planet of the Associations. I'm Seth Kahn.
And I'm Mark Levy.
And we're glad you're here because we're going to shake your world. What were you going to say, Mark?
What I was going to say is to remind everyone to make sure you're in the right place, right? Is that Planet of the Associations is a series for C-level people predominantly. You don't have to be C-level, but C-level people of associations. It's about the association of the near future, the association 3 years from now, X+3, whenever it is you're watching this program. It's like, what's the association of the future going to be like 3 years from now? And if I may, I'd like to begin with a little story, right? Because we approach these things, we don't necessarily tackle problems or situations or futurism head on. We kind of take side routes to get there because, right, if you attack it head on, often you're just using the same old responses and ideas that you always have used before, right? That's the premise around it. So in order to come up with something brand new and something truly useful, to get a useful conversation going, you kind of need to take often, not always, but often indirect routes. Do I have that right, Seth?
You do. And another metaphor I use is it's a lot like seduction, right? You can't just walk up to someone and say, hey, your place or mine. You got to have dinner. You got to get to know them, and the sparks start to fly. And then there's energy, there's chemistry, and then it's a natural progression.
So this is dinner. So let me tell you let me tell you my dinner story. So I was watching, I don't know if it was an interview with him. This was like a year ago or so. But Patton Oswald, who is the brilliant stand-up comic and actor, just, beyond belief great. So Patton Oswald, wherever it was I was seeing this, he was telling a story. So the story was that he almost always would perform his comedy routines at comedy clubs, right? Makes sense. And so one day, though, he got a call from someone at a casino, at a major casino. And they said to him, we want you to play our casino. And he said, I don't normally play casinos. But the figure that she quoted him to play one night was so enormous. He said it could send my daughter, we want to send my daughter to private school. It could pay for her private school for the year, to do one night. So he just couldn't pass it up. He said, that's great. I'll play it. Thank you. And so the night of the performance, he came to the casino and he met the woman backstage who had hired him. And she had said, okay, so the audience out there is 400 of our high rollers. These are the people spending 6 and 7 and 8 figures here.
These are the Saudi princes.
All it is. What's that?
These are the Saudi princes.
That's right. So 400 of the highest rollers, that's the only people in the audience. And we want you to make them just make them so happy. That's what we want you to do. And so Patton Oswald said, okay, well, let's see. I'll play an hour then, right? Because that's his standard thing. It's I'll play for an hour. And she said, no, play for 15 minutes. Do 15 minutes. And she was paying him something so far beyond he had ever been paid before that it didn't seem right. And he said, no, I can do an hour. And she said, I promise you 15 minutes is fine. If you want to do a half an hour, fine, but you really don't have to. We'll be happy with 15 minutes. And he said, okay, great. So half an hour. All right, great. And so he walks out on stage. And the moment that he walks out, people are screaming his name. It's all these high rollers and they're screaming his name. And what he didn't realize is that the room of 400, they had all been drinking, decadently drinking, they were all drunk or whatnot. And they all knew him. And so he stood at center stage by the microphone and he said, for the next half an hour, all they did was shout my resume at me. He said, they were saying King of Queens because he was on King of Queens, and Ratatouille. He played the main voice of Ratatouille, Drunk History, all these different things. They were just yelling out his resume, all the things he had been in. And he just kept on saying, yep. He didn't say anything, right? And he was smiling at them because every time he went to say something, they wouldn't stop. So he said a half an hour went by and they were still yelling out episodes of things that he had been on or so. And he had promised he would be off in a half an hour. He looked at his watch and he said, okay, thank you. And they gave him a standing ovation. He hadn't told a single joke. And so he's walking off stage and he feels horrible because he sees the woman from the casino in the wings. And he's saying, oh my God, I blew it. They hired me to tell jokes and I didn't tell a single joke. I wonder if they're going to pay me even. And he walks off and she meets him there in the wings. And she said, right, he thinks maybe she's going to scream at him. And she says, that was fantastic. Like, they're cheering, they're giving you standing ovations. They're having an amazing time. We have 14 other properties. We have 14 other casinos. Do you think you could do the same thing there? And so to me, the interesting thing, you need to hear Patton Oswald tell that story because he's just beyond, as I said, amazing. But to me, the interesting thing about that story is, from a business person's perspective, is that sometimes we don't understand what value is. That sometimes what we consider value is not what the other person, what the marketplace or the employees or senior leadership or whatnot. Like, we have different ideas of what value is. Patton Oswald, in that story at least, he thought my entire value is around telling jokes. That's what I do. If I'm not telling jokes, I don't have much value. And the woman from the casino, to her, the value of Patton Oswald was, these are 400 of our highest rollers who we make hundreds of millions of dollars off them. We want them to be ecstatically happy. So you accomplish that. Just because you didn't use the feature of what it is, your joke telling, that doesn't matter. The outcome was what we were looking for and you delivered. And I thought that was an interesting idea for us to talk about with associations and the association of the future. It's like, what are the outcomes like, what is value for an association? What is perceived value? What are the different kinds of values? Might we be really wrong on what we're thinking about value?
And where's value going? I mean, value's in a transformation now. First of all, there was the pandemic, which really changed the game. But now we're moving out of the pandemic into a new world, and we don't really know what's valuable. Like right now, everybody I know would kill to hug somebody, right? Actually, that might actually kill them if they hug them or shake a hand. Many people I know just want to go to an airport. Imagine that. Imagine saying that to someone a year ago.
Right.
You're going to want to go to the airport, right? So value changes based on the context and the environment. And it certainly is the case that many associations are assuming that the value that was good 5 years ago is the same value people want today. I look at my son, 23 years old, right? He would never join one of today's associations. He has no interest in belonging. He has a lot of interest in scooping up knowledge and running with it. So if the association had a class or a PDF or something that he was looking for, he'd be up for paying for that, right? But he doesn't want to be a member. This is a really different, radical way of thinking about, who are we going after here? In fact, I know associations that are changing their business model so that the primary revenue streams are not coming from members. They're not coming from sponsors of events. They're coming from partners or people who are engaged with that particular trade or profession. Well, there's a lot of fear that if that's the majority of revenue, that somehow the mission will become corrupt. But maybe that's how associations are transforming now. Maybe because we're in more of an interoperable world, maybe because there's more intersectionality, maybe because things are flowing through instead of to, the value proposition itself is changing.
I found that interesting what you just said about corrupting the mission statement, because to me as a creative, that sounds like a wonderful exercise. It's like, take your mission. What is your mission? And now, as an exercise, what are different ways to corrupt it? And, like looking at it from this corrupted standpoint. And then, because when you take an idea and you try to break it, it often relaxes you because breaking things is really easy. So when I'm working with someone and they seem kind of tense or they're not coming up with ideas, I almost always turn to the breaking aspect of it. It's like, okay, let's talk about what's wrong here. Let's talk about who this is not for. Let's talk about times when you were certain that this thing should work, but it didn't work. Let's talk about all these, this idea of, it's almost like this idea of deliberate error.
Right.
The concept of deliberate error. It reminds me, I had read about this in a book once, on writing. I can't remember that coinage of deliberate error, but I remember that the person who was writing about this was talking about Viktor Frankl, right? Viktor Frankl wrote Man's Search for Meaning and so forth. And so Frankl, after he escaped, the Nazi labor camps,
right?
He started his own form of therapy based on meaning, logotherapy.
That's right.
And he had one of the techniques that he had in logotherapy was, I can't remember the name of it right now, but what it was essentially, it was a form of deliberate error. It was a form of exaggeration. So I remember, and this is an example of Frankl's. So if someone were sitting there with him in the therapy room and they thought that they sweat too much, and that they were very self-conscious about sweating, and they were embarrassed by sweating or so, Viktor Frankl would say, okay, you're embarrassed with sweating? Let's sweat on purpose right now. He said, I'm going to go first. And I want us to sweat so much that it comes up to our knees in sweat. I just want to, and Frankl on purpose would be exaggerating and making fun and whatnot. And he did that on purpose. And it wasn't really to embarrass the person, but it was just to make them laugh about something that they were far too serious about so that they could see it. So that was a form of of getting breakthroughs in them by creating a deliberate error in their kind of thinking system, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah, it does. And it reminds me of, one of Tony Robbins' techniques. I'm a big Tony Robbins fan. I've been to a lot of his seminars, and he'll take something that someone in the audience is feeling anxious about, and he'll say, let's turn up the anxiety. Get into this with me, right? This is a time out of time. So you're not really in that situation. We're here in this personal growth seminar. Let's take that scenario. First, describe to me the circumstances of the anxiety. And then he says, so how would we turn it up? How would we make it more intense? How would we send you over the edge? And after he's done this for a while, he says, okay, that was great. So now we've got a rheostat. Let's turn it down. Right. And then he comes up with practical techniques for someone to actually take the same circumstances and adjust it so that their anxiety drops.
Oh, that's interesting. So in other words, he on purpose accelerates it up in the worst possible way so that you see that you have conscious ability to make changes. But first he does it in this easy way so that everyone can get involved in the destructive way, because everyone can pile on in destruction, you know? And
well, also you're so busy trying to suppress the anxiety to turn it down, and you're stuck, right? That's why you're asking Tony Robbins to help you, is because you can't turn it down. But nobody's trying to turn it up. And so he shows you, hey, that's easy, right? We can all go there. And then once you've done that, it's like, well, let's just do the inverse. Let's bring it down. So it's very powerful. When you were talking about that earlier thing, it for some reason,
value,
it made me think of, and you're going to have to help me connect the dots on this.
Yes.
And as our listeners may realize at this point, this show is completely unrehearsed.
Right, exactly.
This one of the
imagine if this was structured like what we're doing right now, like how ingenious it would be that we're on purpose going all these
we'd be so smart, wouldn't we?
Right, it was all rehearsed. Right. Right.
So I was talking to a doctor who was running an ICU in California, who's a member of one of the associations that I'm working with. And he shared with me an anecdote from World War II where these fighter planes were coming in after they'd been in the sky. And there was this guy who was running out and he was taking precise measurements of all the bullet holes and, explosions and where the shells had hit them and how big they were and what angle they were coming from.
Oh,
And
I know this story. It's bomber planes, not fighter planes.
You know this story. You know this story.
Yeah.
You have the same source as my client.
Yeah, I am your client. No. I know this story. I forget who popularized this story a couple of decades ago.
Right. So one of the pilots asks him, so what are you doing? And he says, I really want to study, how they're attacking us. And the pilot makes the point, well, if you really want to know what's working for the enemy, you should be measuring the holes on the planes that didn't make it back. Right.
Right.
Because those are the ones where obviously the enemy was effective. So a lot of times we go to the wrong place looking for feedback. Oh, look, I'm connecting the dot. Just because we can get feedback there, not because it's the right place to get the feedback. So,
right. So I hear what you're saying is like we grab on to what we know or what we can do, and we try to make it right, or we try to make it fit regardless of whether it actually fits or not for the situation.
Because it's convenient. So for example, if you're an association and you have a class that you teach and many people take that class and it's a significant source of revenue, then you go to all of those people and you ask them, how do we make the class better? And you do that over and over and over again, year after year after year. And what you find is progressively less and less people are taking the class. And the reason is because you're in an insular loop where you're just going to the same audience, asking for a refinement of what brought them there. And as you get tighter and tighter and tighter in your scope, you leave out more and more people. And who you should be asking are all the members who are not taking the class. What do they want to do, right? Where's the value for them?
Right. That's kind of like the negative space, right?
Yeah.
Painting. It's right. You need to pay attention to, to what's not there. Like, the idea of what voices aren't in the room.
Yes. Yes. I was working at NASA on one of the shuttle disasters, and we were doing this exercise where we were basically polling all of the stakeholders of the shuttle disaster after the fact, right? It was a tragedy. It had already transpired. And now we were asking folks, what was the experience like from your point of view? And the reason that they were doing it is so that they could effectively deal with a crisis situation after it was over. And so we had someone who was, representing Congress. We had someone who was representing the president of the United States. We had people representing the engineers. We had people representing the people who were in the control room. And we went around and we got this very holistic view. But the one group they left out was the group with the most skin in the game, which was the families of the astronauts.
Oh.
And that was a really critical piece. Nobody was taking them into consideration. So as we look at who are all of the players that are involved, one of the things that we have to get good at is understanding the system. What are the critical elements of this system? Who's really invested in what's taking place here?
So when it comes to associations, who is really invested? Like, what are those pieces of the system?
So it's not just the members, it's the customers of the members. One of the things that I know from my business experience is that if you really want to do a good job with your customers, is that you think about what their customers want, right? Because if you're helping your customers satisfy their customers, they're doing well. But many people just get focused on the first tier, just the customer. Quick example, I was talking to the head of graphic design at Hewlett Packard back when it was a Fortune 3 company. And he was sharing with me about when there was a time when the whole printing industry changed. And that was when the iPad came out. When all of a sudden everybody was focusing their document needs on an electronic. This was when I would say the iPad came out. There was a year when I want to say it was 2010 when 14 million iPads were sold in 10 months. I think it was like phenomenal. It was like the iPad had arrived. It didn't come out, it had arrived. And everybody was freaking out about that. And all of the Kinkos and the mom and pop print stores were closing down. There was a lot of M&A activity. Print shops were getting eaten up. And the really large print printers, the ones that take like maybe 300 feet long and, 40 feet tall, those cost so much money that nobody could buy them because technology was iterating so fast that by the time you could pay off the lease with it, you'd already gotten several iterations behind and customers were going elsewhere to get their jobs done. So Hewlett Packard did this thing where they started using they had this great customer relationship management software, and they gave it free to all of their customers to help them survive this really tough time. Because they said, if you can gather data on your customer base, you can adjust your marketing efforts so that you can stay afloat. It was kind of a survival, like throwing them a life preserver, right? And they loved it. The customers loved it. And then they needed support, and that became a tiny revenue stream. And then the customers came and said, well, could we give the same software to our customers? Because we'd like to do the same thing for them. And they said, yeah. HP said, yeah, of course you can. And then you had 3 levels, HP, their customers, and their customers' customers, all using the same CRM. Right. That is a huge potential for Hewlett Packard. If they could get their hands on that data, it's already formatted to be digested and analyzed in the system that they have. They were able to swing that, and they were able to charge for that. And they created a multi-million-dollar revenue stream just in CRM. Right? But the big win was knowing about customers and their behavior, which allowed them then to serve their customers even better and allowed that whole wing of HP to survive that time.
So what would be an example of an association, who their customer is, and then who their customer's customer is?
Well, everyone's got customers. So if you were, for example, to take the plumbers, then you could say the customer's customer is everyone who needs plumbing. So imagine if you could create solutions for everyone who needs plumbing. All of a sudden, you might go from, I don't know how many plumbers are in the Plumbers Association, but I'll take a wild guess and say there's 150,000. I don't know. But how many customers of plumbers are there? Well, there's hundreds of millions in this country alone. Right? So all of a sudden, you need a lot less revenue from each one of those people to make a massive revenue influx. So if you could be teaching plumbers how to better serve their customers and their businesses were growing as a result, the association would see that growth as well.
Are there of customers, are there any tips? Are there any people who it would be surprising that they're the customer's customer? In other words, is it always obvious? Or are there ways to look in the world to see? Because to me, what it is you're saying is that an association has a customer and you're trying to better understand what's important to them and what their life is like out in the world. So are there any other tips for associations to better understand what their members' lives are like out in the world, or what the members' customers are?
Yeah, that's key. So when you're engaged in a strategic foresight activity where you're trying to look into the future so that you can understand emerging trends and take advantage of them before they come, for an association, there's at least 3 levels that they need to look at. There is the customer's world, which is what you just mentioned. What are the stresses that they're going through? Then there's the sector itself. So like if you're in plumbing, then you want to know, is plumbing going through a transformation? Like I just talked about a transformation that was going throughout the printer industry, right? So what are the transformations that are taking place in the sector? And then this one is often overlooked. What's the business model of the association? Is it going through a transformation? Because if you find that your revenues in certain areas are steadily going down, but your sector is still vibrant, then you need to ask the question, what's our business model? And is there a better one that we could be using? So generally in strategic foresight, you want to look in all 3 of those areas as you look for emerging trends and then predict how it is that you might rise to opportunities or overcome challenges coming forward.
So based on what it is you're saying, and I'm thinking back to how we started with this, with the idea of value, that sometimes what we think of as value, what you think of as value and what I think of value may be very, very different. And so how do you dope out value for all these different kinds of groups of people? First, let's say just definitionally and foundationally, what is value? Like, what does that word mean? And then how do you figure out the different values for the different groups? So what is value? Let me answer the question for you, because I'll answer it better than you. No. when I think of value, the first thing I think of, I think of money. It always freaked me out as a kid. I could never understand like the concept of that there was gold up until when, 1971 or 1972,
Right.
there was gold backing up paper money. But like, what was paper? It was just this agreement. Like the whole
Right.
idea just didn't quite make any sense to me. So that everything I think about, whenever I think about value, the very first thing I think about is gold in my mind. I'm not saying gold is the thing. I'm just saying, if you say the word value to me, I think gold. Okay. And then I go on to my next thought. So what's your definition of value?
Value to me is what compels somebody to spend their own resources to secure something. And the word compel is really important. Not forces, not in a choiceless situation, but when people have total free will, when there's a lot of options available and they have an excitement response. I want that. That lust, that desire, that is at the source of value. And, I always think of, when I think of value, I think of this one experience on a family vacation many, many years ago when iPhones were brand new. People were, what was that iPhone that wasn't an iPhone? It did everything except make phone calls. Apple sold it for a long time. It looked like an iPhone, but you play games on it. You could listen to music on it. It wasn't an iPod. It was one step up from an iPod. Well, I'll remember it. Maybe in the next episode, I'll say, oh yeah, that's what it was. Right. Anyways, Apple had this device that you could get that did everything short of make a phone call. And I remember that my niece, who was just about 6 years old at the time, she got one of these from her mom. It was her mom's, it wasn't hers, but she got a hold of it and she took it to my son, who was a couple of years older than her. And he started showing her how she could use it to play games. And she got all involved in that. And then he started showing her how she could use the App Store to download games. And then that was even more exciting. And I just remember her being on the couch with holding this little device in her hand and screaming as she jumped off that, I've done it. This is it. That was value. That to me was
the scream. That scream was value.
It was like pouring through her body, right? It was like a current. Well, when you're buying a Snickers bar, it may not pour through your body like that, but there's some part of you that wants that Snickers bar, or wants that class, or wants to be able to network with other people in your space. That driving force in you, to me, that's value. And that's what we've got to figure out. Who does it? How does that get done for the other person? The kind of like essential story about that is the little kid who unpacks a toy for Christmas and plays with the box, right?
Right.
I mean, that's showing you where the value is. And if the parent is upset or it keeps pulling the toy and saying, look at this, look at this, look at this, that's like a business owner trying to foist a product or service on a customer, right? It's not going to work.
Right. Yeah. Well, and what it is you're saying makes me think like that the creation of value, because we're talking about these moments when value is created, the scream, all these things like that, those are the moments of value, the biting into the Snickers bar. But it's interesting that sometimes that even though we think about that moment when the value is realized, that the value creation often has to happen way ahead of time. Like you can't wait. The moment, you have to visualize the moments where the value is crackling, like when it's being realized in the world. But then you have to think far enough ahead in order. I'm not saying this is some brilliant thought, but I'm just saying it made me what you were talking about. Like value, I guess, can be impromptu or spontaneous, but often is not. It requires tremendous foresight ahead of time. I remember a friend of mine, a guy prominent in the entertainment industry, the TV industry. He said to me, he used to live in California, and he said, you would always, he said, wherever you were eating or so, you'd always run into producers and backers, and just wherever you were. And he said, you always had to have a script written. Like you always had, because you had to be prepared because you didn't know when it was going to happen. So you better had a script ready.
Like carry it with you.
Say it again.
Carry it with you.
Right,
under
right.
your arm in a manila envelope. Like, you may run into 7-Eleven to grab a donut, but you've got your script under your arm because you don't know.
Right. But you're thinking about this big moment when you're going to be discovered or when you're going to pitch it or whatnot. But the value creation, like, does it happen in that moment or does it happen way before when you're writing the script? I mean, I guess it happens in all places. But the last thing I'd like to say for this episode is the idea of when you have to think about value, but you also have to think about, I think value can be realized at different times during an engagement or right? It's not a one-time thing. It may seem like a one-time thing, but what are all the ways you can create value ahead of time? What's the moment of most intense value? And what's value after the fact? Like, all these value has it's like a grid. It like keeps going.
And when we come back in our next episode, I want to talk about double-sided value, because I'll make the argument that in a business context, value is always at least double-sided. It's never singular.
Even though I don't know what it is you're going to say, I'm going to refute your argument soundly in the next episode.
We'll see you in the next episode of Planet of the Associations. Blah, 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 blah.